The Texan. It was love at first sight. The first time Yozarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. Yozarian was in the hospital with a pain in his liver that fell just short of being jaundice. The doctors were puzzled by the fact that it wasn't quite jaundice. If it became jaundice, they could treat it. If it did not become jaundice and went away, they could discharge him. But But this just being short of jaundice all the time confused them. Each morning they came around, three brisk and serious men with efficient mouths and inefficient eyes, accompanied by brisk and serious nurse Duckett, one of the ward nurses, and who did not like Yozarian. They read the chart at the foot of the bed and asked impatiently about the pain. They seemed irritated when he told them it was exactly the same. Still no movement, the full colonel demanded. The doctors exchanged a look when he shook his head. Give him another pill. Nurse Duckett made a note to give Yozarian another pill, and the four of them moved along to the next bed. None of the nurses liked Yozarian. Actually, the pain in his liver had gone away, but Yozarian did not say anything, and the doctors never suspected. They just suspected that he had been moving his bowels and not telling anyone. Yozarian had everything he wanted in the hospital. The food wasn't too bad, and his meals were brought to him in the bed. There were extra rations of fresh meat, and during the hot part of the afternoon, he and others were served chilled fruit juice or chilled chocolate milk. Apart from the doctors and the nurses, no one ever disturbed him. For a little while in the morning, he had to censor letters. But he was free after that to spend the rest of the day lying around idly with a clear conscience. He was comfortable in the hospital and it was easy to stay on because he always ran a temperature of 101. He was even more comfortable than Dunbar, who had to keep falling down on his face in order to get his meals brought to him in bed. After he had made up his mind to spend the rest of the war in the hospital, Yozarian wrote letters to everyone he knew saying that he was in the hospital, but never mentioning why. One day he had a better idea. To everyone he knew, he wrote that he was going on a very dangerous mission. They asked for volunteers. It's very dangerous, but someone has to do it. I will write you the instant I get back. And he had not written anyone since. All the officer patients in the ward were forced to censor letters written by all the enlisted men patients who were kept in the residence and wards of their own. It was a monotonous job, and Yozarian was disappointed to learn that the lives of the enlisted men were only slightly more interesting than the lives of the officers. After the first day, he had no curiosity at all. To break the monotony, he invented games. Death to all modifiers, he declared one day, and out of every letter that passed through his hands went every adverb and every adjective. The next day, he made war on articles. He reached a much higher plane of creativity the following day when he bragged out everything in the letters but a, an, and the. They erected more dynamic intralinear tensions he felt, and in just about every case left a message far more universal. Soon he was proscribing parts of salutations and signatures and leaving the text untouched. One time he blacked out all but the salutations, Dear Mary, from a letter, and at the bottom he wrote, I yearn for you tragically. Aru Shipman, chaplain, US Army. Aru Shipman was the group chaplain's name. When he had exhausted all possibilities in the letters, he began attacking the names and addresses on the envelopes, obliterating whole homes and streets, annihilating entire metropolises with careless flicks of his wrist as though he were God. Catch 22 required that each censored letter bear the censoring officer's name. Most letters he did not read at all. On those he did not read at all, he wrote his own name. On those he did read, he wrote Washington Irving. When that grew monotonous, he wrote Irving Washington. Censoring the envelopes had serious repercussions, produced a ripple of anxiety on some ethereal military echelon that floated a CID man back into the ward posing as a patient. They all knew he was a CID man because he kept inquiring about an officer named Irving or Washington, and because after his first day there he would not censor letters. He found them too monotonous. It was a good ward this time, one of the best he and Dunbar had ever enjoyed. With them this time was 24-year-old fighter pilot captain with the sparse golden moustache who had been shot into the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and not even caught cold. Now the summer was upon them. The captain had not been shot down, and he said he had the grippe. In the bed of Usarian's right, still lying armlessly on his belly, was startled captain with malaria in his blood and a mosquito bite on his ass. Across the aisle from Usarian was Dunbar. The next to Dunbar was the artillery captain with whom Usarian had stopped playing chess. The captain was a good chess player, and the games were always interesting. Usarian had stopped playing chess with him because the games were so interesting they were foolish. Then there was the educated Texan from Texas who looked like someone in Technicolor and felt patriotically that people of means, decent folks, should be given more votes than drifters, whores, criminals, degenerates, atheists, and indecent folk. People without means. Usarian was unspringing rhythms in the letters the day they bought the Texan in. It was another quiet, hot, untroubled day. The heat pressed heavily on the roof, stifling sound. Dunbar was lying motionless on his back again, and his eyes staring up at the ceiling like a doll's. He was working hard at increasing his lifespan. He did it by cultivating boredom. Dunbar was working so hard at increasing his lifespan that Usarian thought he was dead. They put the Texan in the bed in the middle of the ward, and it wasn't long before he donated his views. Dunbar sat up like a shot. That's it, he cried excitedly. There was something missing. All the time I knew there was something missing, and now I know what it is. He banged his fist down into his palm. No patriotism, he declared. You're right, Usarian shouted back. You're right, you're right, you're right. The hot dog, the Brooklyn Dodgers, mom's apple pie. That's what everyone's fighting for. But who's fighting for the decent folk? Who's fighting for more votes for the decent folk? There's no patriotism. That's what it is. And no matriotism either. The warrant officer on Usarian's left was unimpressed. Who gives a shit? He asked tiredly and turned over to his side to go to sleep. The Texan turned out to be a good natured, generous, and likable. In the 3 days, no one could stand him. He sent shudders of annoyance scampering up ticklish spines, and everybody fled from him. Everybody but the soldier in white, who had no choice. The soldier in white was encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze. He had 2 useless legs and 2 useless arms. He had been smuggled into among them until they awoke in the morning and saw the 2 strange legs hoisted from the hips, the 2 strange arms anchored up perpendicularly, all 4 limbs pinioned strangely in air by lead weights suspended darkly above him that never moved. Sewed into the bandages over the insides of both elbows were zippered lips through which he was fed clear fluid from a clear jar. A silent zinc pipe rose from the cement on his groin and was coupled to a slim rubber hose that carried waste from the kidneys and dripped if efficiently into a clear stopper jar on the floor. When the jar on the floor was full, the jar feeding his elbow was empty, and the two were simply swished quickly so that the stuff could drip back into him. And they ever really saw of the soldier in white was a frayed black hole over his mouth. The soldier in white had been filled next to Texan, and the Texan sat sideways on his own bed and talked to him throughout the morning and afternoon, evening in a pleasant, sympathetic drawl. The Texan never minded that he got no reply. Temperatures were taken twice in a day in the ward. Early each morning and late each afternoon, Nurse Kramer entered with a jar full of thermometers and worked her way up one side of the ward and down the other, distributing a thermometer to each patient. She managed the soldier in the white by inserting a thermometer into the hole over his mouth and leaving it balanced there on the lower rim. When she returned to the man in the first bed, she took his thermometer and recorded his temperature, and then moved on to the next bed and continued around the ward again. One afternoon, when she had completed her first circuit of the ward and came a second time to the soldier in white, she read his thermometer and discovered that he was dead. Murderer, Dunbar said quietly. The Texan looked up at him with an uncertain grin. Killer, Usarian said. What are you fellas talking about? The Texan asked nervously. You murdered him, said Dunbar. You killed him, said Usarian. The Texan shrank back. You fellas are crazy. I did not even touch him. You murdered him, said Dunbar. I heard you kill him, said Usarian. You killed him because he was a nigger. Dunbar said. You fellas are crazy, the Texan cried. They don't allow niggers in here. They got a special place for niggers. The sergeant smuggled him in, Dunbar said. The communist sergeant, said Usarian, and you knew it. The warrant officer on Usarian's left was unimpressed by the entire incident of the soldier in white. The warrant officer was unimpressed by everything and never spoke at all, unless it was to show irritation. The day before Usarian met the chaplain, a stove exploded in the mess hall and set fire to one side of the kitchen. An intense heat flashed through the areas. Even in Usarian's ward, almost 300 feet away, they could hear the roar of the blaze and the sharp cracks of flaming timber. Smoke sped past the orange tinted windows. In about 15 minutes, the crashed trucks from the airfield arrived to fight the fire. For a frantic half hour, it was touch and go. Then the firemen began to get the upper hand. Suddenly, there was the monotonous old drone of bombers returning from a mission, and the firemen had to roll up their hoses and speed back to the field in case one of the planes crashed and caused fire. The planes landed safely. As soon as the last one was down, the firemen wheeled their trucks around and raced back up to the hill to resume their fight with the fire at the hospital. When they got there, the blaze was out. It had died of its own accord, expired completely without even an ember to be watered down. And there was nothing for the disappointed fireman to do but drink tepid coffee and hang around trying to screw the nurses. The chaplain arrived the day after the fire. Usarian was busy expurgating all but romance words from the letters when the chaplain sat down in the chair between the beds and asked him how he was feeling. He had placed himself a bit to one side, and the captain's bar on the tab of his shirt collar were all the insignia Usarian could see. Usarian had no idea who he was, and just took it for granted that he was either another doctor or another madman. Oh, pretty good, he answered. I've got a slight pain in my liver, and I haven't been the most regular of the fellows, I guess. But all in all, I must admit that I feel pretty good. That's good, said the chaplain. Yes, Usarian said. Yes, that is good. I meant to come around sooner, the chaplain said, but I really haven't been well. That's too bad, Usarian said. Just a head cold, the chaplain added quickly. I've got a fever of 101, Usarian added just as quickly. That's too bad, said the chaplain. Yes, Usarian agreed. Yes, that is too bad. The chaplain fidgeted. Is there anything I can do for you? He asked for a while. No, Usarian sighed. The doctors are doing all that's humanly possible, I suppose. No, the chaplain colored faintly. I did not mean anything like that. I meant cigarettes or books or toys. No, Usarian said. Thank you, I have everything I need, I suppose. Everything but good health. That's too bad. Yes, Usarian said. Yes, that's too bad. The chaplain stirred again. He looked from side to side a few times, then gazed up at the ceiling, then down at the floor. He drew a deep breath. Lieutenant Nately sends his regards, he said. Usarian was sorry to hear they had a mutual friend. It seemed there was a basis to their conversation after all. You know Lieutenant Nately? He asked regretfully. Yes, I know Lieutenant Nately quite well. He's a bit loony, isn't he? The chaplain's smile was embarrassed. I'm afraid. I could not say. I don't think I know him that well. You can take my word for it, Usarian said. He's goofy as they come. The chaplain weighed the next silence heavily and then shattered it with an abrupt question. You are Captain Usarian, aren't you? Nately had a bad start. He came from a good family. Please excuse me, the chaplain persisted timorously. I may be committing a very grave error. Are you Captain Usarian? Yes, Captain Usarian confessed. I am Captain Usarian of the 256th Squadron. Of the fighting 256th Squadron, Usarian replied. I did not know there were any other Captain Usarians. As far as I know, I am only Captain Usarian I know. But that's only as far as I know. I see, the chaplain said unhappily. That's two to the fighting eighth power, Usarian pointed out. If you're thinking of writing a symbolic poem about our squadron, no, mumbled the chaplain. I'm not thinking of writing a symbolic poem about your grand squadron. Usarian straightened sharply when he spied the tiny silver cross on the other side of Chaplin's collar. He was thoroughly astonished, for he had never really talked with a chaplain before. You are a chaplain, he exclaimed ecstatically. I did not know you were a chaplain. Why, yes, the chaplain answered. Didn't you know I was a chaplain? Why, no, I did not know you were a chaplain. Usarian stared at him with a big, fascinated grin. I've never really seen a chaplain before. The chaplain flushed again and gazed down at his hands. He was a slight man of about 32, with tan hair and brown, diffident eyes. His face was narrow and rather pale. An innocent nest of ancient pimples, prickles lay in the basin of each cheek. Usarian wanted to help him. Can I do anything at all to help you? The chaplain asked. Usarian shook his head, still grinning. No, I'm sorry. I have everything I need and I'm quite comfortable. In fact, I'm not even sick. That's good. As soon as the chaplain said the words, he was sorry and shoved his knuckles into his mouth with a giggle of alarm. But Usarian remained silent and his disappointed him. There are other men in the group I must visit, he apologized finally. I've come to see you again, probably tomorrow. Please do that, Usarian said. I will come only if you want me to, the chaplain said, lowering his head shyly. I've noticed that I make many of the men uncomfortable. Usarian glowed with affection. I want you to, he said. You won't make me uncomfortable. The chaplain beamed gratefully and then peered down at a slip of paper he had been concealing in his hand all the while. He counted along in the beds in the wards, moving his lips, and then centered his attention dubiously on Dunbar. May I inquire? He whispered softly, if that is Lieutenant Dunbar. Yes, Usarian answered loudly. That is Lieutenant Dunbar. Thank you, the chaplain whispered. Thank you very much. I must visit with him. I must visit with every member of the group who is in the hospital, even those in other wards, Usarian asked. Even those in other wards. Be careful in the other wards, Father, Usarian warned. That's where they keep the mental cases. They are filled with lunatics. Isn't it necessary to call me? It isn't necessary to call me Father, the chaplain explained. I am an Anabaptist. I am dead serious about those other wards, Usarian continued grimly. MPs won't protect you because they are craziest of all. I'd go with you myself, but I'm scared stiff. Insanity is contagious. This is the only sane ward in the whole hospital. Everybody is crazy but us. This is probably the only sane ward in the whole world, for the matter. The chaplain rose quickly and edged away from Usarian's bed, and then nodded with a conciliating smile, and promised to conduct himself with appropriate caution. And now I must visit the Lieutenant Dunbar, he said. Still he lingered remorsefully. How is Lieutenant Dunbar? He asked at last. As good as they go, Usarian assured him. A true prince, one of the finest, least dedicated men in the whole world. I did not mean that, the chaplain answered, whispering again. Is he very sick? No, he is not very sick. In fact, he is not sick at all. That's good, the chaplain sighed with relief. Yes, Usarian said. Yes, that is good. A chaplain, Dunbar said, when the chaplain had visited him and gone. Did you see that? A chaplain? Wasn't he sweet? Said Usarian. Maybe they should give him 3 votes. Who's they? Dunbar demanded suspiciously. In a bed, in the small private section at the end of the ward, always working ceaselessly behind the green plyboard partition, was the solemn middle-aged colonel, who was visited every day by a gentle, sweet-faced woman in curly blonde hair, who was not a nurse and not a vac and not a Red Cross girl, but who nevertheless appeared faithfully at the hospital in Pianosa each afternoon wearing pretty pastel summer dresses that were very smart and white leather pumps with heels half high at the base of nylon seams that were inevitably straight. The colonel was in communications and he was kept busy day and night transmitting glutinous messages from the interior into the square pads of case, which he sealed meticulously and delivered to the bed. The colonel was gorgeous. He had a cavernous mouth, cavernous cheek, cavernous, sad mid-hued eyes. His face was the color of clouded silver. He coughed quietly, gingerly, and dabbed the pad slowly at his lips with a distaste that had become automatic. The colonel dwelt in a vortex of specialists who were still specializing in trying to determine what was troubling him. They heard lights in his eyes to see if he could see, rammed needles into nerves to hear if he could feel. There was a urologist for his urine, a lymphologist for his lymph, an endocrinologist for his endocrines, a psychologist for his psyche, a dermatologist for his drama. There was a pathologist for his pathos, a cystologist for his cyst, and a bald and pedantic cytologist from the zoology department at Harvard who had been shanghaied ruthlessly into medical corps by a faulty an IBM machine and spent his sessions with the dying colonel trying to discuss Moby Dick with him. The colonel had really been investigated. There was not an organ of his body that had not been drugged and derogated, dusted, dredged, fingered, photographed, removed, plundered, and replaced. Neat, slender, and erect, the women touched him often as she sat by his bedside, and was the epitome of stately sorrow each time she smiled. The colonel was tall, thin, stooped. When he rose to walk, he bent forward even more, making a deep cavity in his body, and placed his feet down very carefully, moving ahead by inches from the knees down. There were violent pools under his eyes. The woman spoke softly, softer than the colonel coughed, and none of the men in the ward ever heard her voice. In less than 10 days, the Texan cleared the ward. The artillery captain broke first, and after the exodus started, Dunbar, Yozarian, and fighter captain all bolted the same morning. Dunbar stopped having dizzy spells, and the fighter captain blew his nose. Yozarian told the doctors that the pain in his liver had gone away. It was as easy as that. Even the warrant officer flew. In less than 10 days, the Texan drove everybody in the ward back to duty. Everybody but the CID man, who had caught cold from the fighter captain and come down with pneumonia.